So, welcome to this year's Creighton Lecture, which is the third of our annual conversations on history, in which we think together about why history matters. My name is Claire Langhamer, and I'm Director of the Institute of Historical Research, the UK's national home for history and historians. And for those of you who don't know where we are, we're at the other side of this building. Please do come and see us and use our library, which is very good. So in our Creighton lectures, as I say, we try and make the case for history and why it matters, and to think about why it matters beyond the university. In our 2023 Creighton Lecture, we tackled history and music with the band Public Sector Broadcasting. Last year, we looked at the relationship between history and journalism in a conversation with Clive Myrie. And this evening, we turn to creative writing, and in particular, to think about poetry. What happens if we do history through poetry? And we have two very special guests to help us address this question. The historian, Catherine Clarke, and the poet, Hannah Lowe. We'll be talking for around about 45 minutes, and then there will be time for your own contributions. So please do have a think about what you might like to say, or what you might like to ask, towards the end of the session in here. And then afterwards, we have a reception in the space outside, to which everybody is invited. It is well catered, so please do come along and help us use the catering up. And you will be invited also to talk to our speakers, and if the mood takes you, you may even want to buy a book. But we'll see how we go. But first, some proper introductions. So I'll start with Catherine. Catherine is a professor at the Institute of Historical Research, though she also has many other roles. She was originally a specialist in medieval literature and culture, but now publishes widely across periods with particular interest in place, heritage, and uses of the past. Her new book, which I should model, A History of England in 25 Poems, has just been published by Penguin. I mean, literally just been published. When was it published? Last Thursday. There you go. So it is properly hot off the press. It is also a masterclass in how to write creatively and engagingly about the past for wider audiences. So we'll be celebrating its publication with wine immediately after this event. So as I say, please do stay around for that section of the evening. Hannah, it's an absolute delight to have you with us as well. Hannah is an award-winning poet and memoirist, and Professor in Creative Writing at Brunel University. Hannah's poetry collections include Chick, 2013, Chan, 2016, The Neighbourhood, 2019, and the more recent Kids. And the Kids was the winner of the Costa Poetry Award and the Costa Book Award in 2021. And for those who don't know it, it's just a beautiful meditation on how we teach and how we learn. I just absolutely loved reading it, I really did. Hannah's work addresses heritage, race, identity, place and legacy, telling the big stories of history within the most intimate and profoundly moving of frames. So I've said quite a lot, so I'm going to stop now. And I'm going to ask really if both of you in turn would just take 5 minutes or so to tell us a little more about you, about what you do, and about why you do it. Who would like to start?
I think it's me, following the slides. Thank you so much, Claire, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for making it here this evening. So slightly concerning when you click on the slide and nothing happens. Oh, there we go. That's why I went first. sorted. So yeah, so no surprises, I suppose, at the aspect of my work that I'm going to focus on, particularly in our conversation this evening, is my new book that Claire already did a fabulous job of plugging. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. So it tells the history of England from the 8th century to the present day through 25 poems, and it uses those poems as kind of portals to take us into moments in the past. So a real range. The poem that Queen Victoria turned to after the death of Albert, that's kind of trying to make sense of new scientific discovery alongside religious faith and consolation. Guerrilla poetry, written in English after 1066, holding William the Conqueror to account. Poetry that takes us below stairs in a country house. A deserted railway station and birdsong on the eve of the Great War. Voices from inside a medieval pandemic and the lived experience of the Black Death. And I begin the book with an image that came to me, quite literally, but it came into my hands here in Senate House when I was working in special collections in Senate House Library. So the beautiful little book that you can see in the picture here is a 1662 collection of royalist poetry against the short-lived English Republic. And it's the book where I found the fabulously scatological ballad Bum Fodder that is one of the chapters in the book. My son loves that one, 21 stanzas of bum, poo and fart jokes to enjoy. But you can probably, hopefully, just make out on the picture on the left-hand side here, in this book there is a wormhole. And pasted in the front cover, there's a note from Max Brothers booksellers, noting that there's a wormhole through some pages at the end. You can see right through to the end papers. And that really got me thinking about wormholes in a kind of science fiction sense, and the idea of a way to connect directly with another point in place and time, and really thinking about how poetry can be a very particularly, very powerful, very special and magical kind of portal or wormhole into the past. So really that was a metaphor for thinking about a different kind of way into history through poetry. And these are some of the, it's my clicker technique, I think is not good. These are some illustrations from the book by the brilliant Edward Betterson. As Claire said, I'm a professor of history at the IHR, but my background is actually in English literature, as Claire noted. In my day job at the IHR, I spend a lot of time in search of England, leading the Victoria County History of England project. But my academic background sits across the two disciplines. And I've learned in my career that sitting at the edge of or between disciplines can often give us license to do things a bit differently and to break some of the rules. Now, I don't want to set up too much of a divide, and I know that's what we'll be unpicking in our conversation this evening. Those of us in the room know that historians often use literature as a source. The literature specialists, of course, historicise texts that they're working on. But I think in public discourse, poetry is often presented as something really timeless and universal that speaks in an essentialist way across periods. But of course, poetry is rooted in its moment. It speaks to its own moment. It's written to make something happen. It's invested. It's got skin in the game. So this book is really trying to look at that. And I think writing this book from a position... Oh, sorry, I skipped through two of mine there. Writing a book from a position between disciplines has also helped me to maybe challenge and unpick some of the precepts and conventions of both English literature and history. So first of all, this is not a kind of best of, greatest hits, 25 best poems in the English language book. It's trying to break away from the canon. It's not necessarily focusing on the poems that are the best. There are words to cherish, but it's following the poems that tell the most fascinating stories about their own historical moments. Some of the poems, definitely not kind of the greatest hits of their writers. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Cry of the Children is a good example, quite mawkish, quite sentimental to us today, written as a protest against Victorian child labour, as a reaction against a tragedy in a coal mine that killed 26 children. It may not be her best verse, but it was an activist poem, and it had an impact, it made change, it did work, it made things happen in its moment. And I've tried really hard to include a range of diversity of voices taking us outside the canon, so poems by men and women, different social classes, voices of colour. Even one of the poems in the book is written by a child. So I think writing a history of England through poetry has allowed me to explore the multivocality of England's story, the way the idea of England has always been complicated and contested and colourful. I also think and I think it's something we might talk more about, it's enabled me to kind of think with feeling more than I do quite often in my historical research, and to write feeling back into the history of England. But the process has opened up so many questions about doing history through poetry for me that I'm looking forward to exploring together this evening.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Hannah.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and congratulations to you, Catherine, on your book publication. Well, I'll probably talk a little more personally. I can't really not about my own work, which begins with the catalyst of my own father, who's pictured here on the picture on the left, in Hampstead in 1954 with my half-brother, Rob, who's now 72. So I never started writing poetry in order to engage with history. I think I would have been thinking more in terms of heritage. When my father died, he was Afro-Chinese, my dad, that migrated to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. And he was very, very silent about his life. He never talked about his upbringing in Jamaica or about his migration and what the difficult years must have been in Britain for him at that time as a post-war migrant. And when he died, when I was 21, I felt this enormous absence, the lack of information, the loss of that story, and as it turns out, of that history. And so my writing really begins with, I guess, a personal archive. An example of which is this photo, but I placed it side by side with a photograph I found around about the same time I saw this photo, a magazine article from the Picture Post of the same year with the caption, "Would you let your daughter marry a Negro?" So that speaks something to the kind of social and historical conditions at the time. But for me, it was also about, it made me think very strongly about the myth of the absent black father that has existed historically in this country. And so there's something about putting those two photographs together that felt important to me in terms of thinking about the differences between public archives and personal archives. And perhaps in terms of my own writing and in relation to Catherine's book, my own ambivalent feelings towards Englishness as someone who looks as though I'm probably white and English, but I'm actually something quite different and have a different heritage. And I think that's another reason I began writing poetry, was to sort of, as a method of inquiry, to find out more about, who I actually was in relation to these histories. Let me move on my slides. Oh, which one am I pressing?
It's a bit tricksy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Give it a few.
What, really hard? That one? Oh, yeah. So, I guess one of the first historical documents that I engaged with was a notebook that my father had left that I didn't read till after he died, which was unbelievably about his early years growing up in Jamaica. So as a historical source for my own writing, it was really stimulating and galvanising. It's part of my personal archive, but it was also featured in the Songs in a Strange Land exhibition at the British Library, which focused on post-war migration. So the idea that there's this just kind of conceptual divide between the personal and the public archive is therefore up for question. But I'll just read what my dad has written in this notebook, which will maybe give you a little bit of an idea of why I'm so inquisitive And he says, I do not know the exact date or year of my father's arrival in Jamaica, but my guess is about 1918 or 20. The little information I had of his past life, he was born somewhere in Canton in China and came to Jamaica under the sponsorship of a cousin who was in business on the island. This vagueness comes about because my father, even though he had parental responsibility for my upbringing, hardly ever spoke to me other than to give a command in relation to the running of the shop, which was his livelihood. And I think there's a brilliant historical echo there in the fact that his father never spoke to him and mine never really spoke of those sorts of things, the kind of the big stories of empire and migration and diaspora to me. And there are so many questions that are raised in that little statement about perhaps the history of Chinese groceries in the Caribbean, Canton in China, which is now known as Guangdong, but why there was immigration from that place in China to the Caribbean, and so on, the questions kept coming. And then this is from the very end of my father's notebook, which is only really an account of the first 23 years of his life, where he says, my thoughts turned to immigration as a way out of my predicament. I'd been hearing from people that it was easy to get to England, so I started to make inquiries as to how I could get there. I soon found out that you could book a passage on ships bringing back servicemen who had fought in the Second World War. So I duly booked my passage on the SS Ormond, paying the princely sum of £28 to get to England. So there's a moment where the personal story of migration and of departure really collides with public histories by the naming of not only a movement that we now know as being called the Windrush Migration, but also the naming of a ship. Well, what I found out at that point, and I was working on this probably 18 years ago now, is that the Ormond had arrived before the Windrush. And if you know anything about the Windrush, you know that it arrived in 1948, and Ormond came in 47. So I began to think, well, hang on, why is this ship being historicised as the first when there was a ship before it? And then I started thinking, well, what else might not be true about that narrative? And then I started thinking about, how does anything get historicised? So it was really opening up big questions in my mind. Just a couple more slides to illustrate a little bit more about my...
That is not just me, Hannah.
No, it really doesn't. Oh, no, it's gone. Yeah, I just thought I would show that how my personal research then opened up onto kind of the research you might think more as traditional historical research in terms of archives. And it's the passenger list from the Ormond that shows my dad listed there as a passenger. He's rather imaginatively named himself as a clerk under occupation, where in fact he made all his money from gambling as a professional poker player. And it also has the story, it took me so long to find this tiny little newspaper clipping about the 11 stowaways that came on the Ormond, whose histories, of course, are, in some ways they've been just stereotyped as just being stowaways, but in my poems, in the book that I wrote about the Ormond, I tried to kind of enter with, as you were talking about, like emotion, what it must have been like to stow away on a ship that came from Jamaica and then arrived to Liverpool, but as a stowaway you jumped into the Albert Dock, meters from the shore and swam in. I think I'll finish my introduction there actually, but maybe we could move to the questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you both of you. And I think the first question I want to ask you both really is about what is distinctive about setting poetry and history in a relationship in the way that you're both doing in different ways, whether through the family history, then to the archival history, or through the wormhole. How do you think of your work as kind of distinctive because of the way you're sitting them together?
Well, these days, having done so much historical research, I often say, quite glibly, that if I hadn't been a poet, I would have liked to have been a historian. But I'm also not sure how that much is true. I think the word Catherine kept using was portal. The idea of the poems as being a portal into history. And I suppose I've often said, and again it might be quite clear because I'm not fully sure anymore, like really what historians do. I did history GCSE and I remember there was much talk of primary and secondary sources. So I remember that. But I suspect that historians, when they're writing historic papers, are operating within certain frames of what they the format of a historical paper, that I guess the ideas of truth, things having to be backed up and evidenced, an argument being made. Whereas I always felt that a poem could literally take the historical source material and go at it from any direction at all, which might include things like problematizing the historical material, like interrogating it, questioning it. It might be just picking out one singular detail and using that, because poems so often, certainly my own poems, lots of them hinge on material culture. So the idea of the notebook as being the thing that could be explored, or in the case of my father, and back to the idea of the personal archive, or my dad's dice. My dad was always a poker player, was a dice player. So how I might be able to write about my dad's dice historically. So with a poem like that, there's one in my first collection where I researched the history of loaded dice, which goes back to the Romans, and I believe that dice were made of bone, and other things that dice were made of. Then the history of loading dice and the different ways in which that's been done, right up to the image of my father bent over the stove, wearing a pair of science goggles, melting something, lead, I'm not sure, with which to load dice. So this kind of blending of history and imagination has been kind of critical to my work. And I suppose I've always felt that I've had free rein to do whatever I wanted in a poem when it comes to history, essentially.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so interesting, that relationship between poetry and history and truth, which is so complicated and so tricky, and something that I spent a lot of time thinking about writing this book, that it's not necessarily the job or the interest of poetry to record truth. Poetry obviously isn't a kind of straightforward mirror of reality in any way, and poetry often treads that margin between reality but also worlds of the imagination, of desire, of fantasy, of lies, frankly. So, an example in the book might be a poem written by Thomas Wyatt that's often used as a sort of smoking gun for whether he had an affair with Anne Boleyn. And in a way, trying to look for those kind of answers in a poem is not the right way to go about it. There are all kinds of tantalising clues, but it's written about desire, about worlds of the mind and worlds of imagination. So I think revisiting those relationships between history, poetry and truth is really interesting. I suppose what another way in which I think approaching history through poetry is distinctive, and it really for me resonates with your work, Hannah, is the way that poetry can play these amazing tricks with scale and can mediate between different kinds of scale in just wonderfully kind of elastic and simultaneous and magical kind of ways. And I love the language you used, Hannah, about personal archive, and that in your poetry there are moments where it's about such intimate personal experience, but also telling these big stories about migration and identity and nation. And I certainly found that in my research for this book. So I already mentioned the example of the Black Death. And I think, navigating the big story of that, the statistics, it's kind of, it's mind-boggling, and it's hard to grasp that. And of course, post-COVID, I think we all know that the statistics alone don't tell the full story of, the human experience and cost of a global pandemic. So in the book, I'm using the late 14th century poem Pearl that I'm sure some of you will know, which is about a father grieving his dead daughter, likely killed by the plague. And so the way that the poem brings us into that incredibly intimate moment, just one story, that resonates in terms of the kind of the suffering and the loss and the grief across the centuries, but allows us a new way into the big story. I think that's really powerful. We've talked about feeling. I'm sure we'll come back to that because I think that's really at the heart of a lot of this, the way poetry connects us with feeling. And I wonder whether another thing that I might just throw in that, again, I really recognise in your work, Hannah, is the way that when we connect poetry with history, it kind of frees us from linear chronology in interesting ways. So I love in your poems about SS Ormond, there's that moment where you talk about winding back Windrush and almost seeing those kind of pivotal moments of mid-20th century migration playing out backwards. And in my book there's Grace Nichols' amazing poem Hurricane Hits England, which is beginning with her memory of the 1987 hurricane, not a hurricane, kind of striking the South Downs where she lives, but it kind of takes her back into memories of her past, and it allows me to kind of do a backward story into, it's only a semantic sidestep from the hurricane to Windrush and thinking about 20th century stories of migration. So kind of playing with linearity and chronology, and of course, a book full of poems, they're always speaking to each other across time. There are all these kind of entanglements. They don't stay in their place on the timeline. They are kind of unruly and messy when it comes to chronology. So I think that's something special as well.
Please. Oh, I wasn't actually, I thought we should probably, I was thinking of the time that maybe questions. That I suppose I could say a little bit more. Maybe I'll just show my next slide, which kind of goes back to the idea of the personal archive. But is this these two images of wall hangings, which were I was sort of speaking to your idea about how you've got the big history, the grand story, and then you've got these very intimate moments. And these are two wall hangings that were hanging on the walls of my childhood home, and now hang on the walls of my home in my flat. And as a child, knowing absolutely nothing about my own heritage, I thought that they'd come all the way from China, and they probably had come from China with my grandfather and ended up in his Chinese grocery in Jamaica, and then my dad had brought them with him to England, and they're actually really valuable historical artefacts. But probably what's much more likely is they were bought mass-produced in Soho, and I've attributed all this value to them. But I thought I could read a poem about these wall hangings, which perhaps illustrates something about the way in which imagination works, and also chronology. I think it's in this little tiny book, which is, the book's actually about Chinese wallpaper, but as a luxury good of empire, but I smuggled in my wall hangings beside this wallpaper that hangs in all these National Trust properties. Chinese wall hangings. After he died, I took them from his wall, each with its pair of songbirds, pink silk plumes and silver beaks. I hung them on my wall in Brixton. If anyone asked, I called them heirlooms from my father's village, from rooms where workers in the mountain half-light sewed pink songbirds to bamboo. Though I thought he'd bought them in Soho from New Loom Moon or Lucky Foods. That's what China was. 2 chipped soup bowls, a fire dragon spoon, the rack of belly pork he'd string across our oven, spitting fat, a Chinese dress from Topshop, and those songbirds, factory copycats, all arranged like a shrine in my tiny flat. Later, I took the lignum vitae sculptures from Jamaica, a Rastafarian girl with smooth swan neck, 2 twists of plaited hair. I sat them in the centre of my windowsill and thought she was my grandmother from the hills of Heartsease, though I knew we'd bought her at Duns River from a higgler hanging to the windows of our car.
Thank you. That's absolutely just lovely. Really lovely.
Well, I was just trying to think about how, I guess in some ways, and I suppose I think that about all the poems that appear in your book, Catherine, and also the poets, is how concerned were any of them with the truth? Because my experience of writing poetry is that you're often leaning into uncertainty, that you're very rarely writing to download what you already know, that it's always about inquiry. And that also, we were chatting earlier, we touched upon this, that for me and certainly many contemporary poets that I know, once we've entered the world of the poem, that's the world where we're concerned with the truth. So things like facts, dates, narrative cohesion don't always factor that highly. And maybe you could, I don't want to take over the questions,
Please do.
but maybe you could say something about that, or if you've made any discoveries in your book that seem to speak to that particularly.
Thank you. So yeah, there's several different ways that I want to come at that. I mean, I think that idea of creating something that is true within the world and the shape and the form of the poem is really significant. And one of the things that I've been very conscious of reading these poems as a way into English history is that it's not always just the content of the poem that is telling you the truth or a truth, but it can be the form of the poem. And I think historians are often used to looking at things for content, for harvesting content from sources. But very often when you're looking at poetry, it's thinking about the form and what that's doing and the statement that that's making that's really important. And I love the way that you use form in your work, using sonnets to write about teaching kids in a comprehensive and the power of that, or kind of forms that come from jazz and the kind of the cultural layerings and kind of dimensions of that. I suppose the other thing that I hope I'm gesturing towards in my book is that there isn't a kind of, this feels like it's not news to anyone, but there's not a single kind of monolithic truth. Just as there is not a single monolithic idea of England or English history or nationhood. And I think the kind of polyvocality of a book that is 25 poems all written by different voices in different moments, and really different voices, as I said. So there's a poem by Mary Leaper, written in the middle of the 18th century. Mary Leaper was a labouring class woman who worked in domestic service, and in her poem Crumble Hall, she takes us below stairs in the country house. So she's kind of responding to the great genre of the country house poem, but we're not a gentleman visitor being guided round, we're not in the parlour, we're not in the ornamental gardens, we're in the kitchens and the back passageways and the cramped attics. So it's a kind of a regendering of the space in many ways as well, a labouring class woman showing us around the house with a kind of language that's sort of like the language of Alexander Pope, but doing something very different in terms of a voice that can allow us to see the labour that's usually erased and the country house poem that's usually hidden. Another voice that I really love in the book that I have a real sense of affection for, there's a poem called Rules and Regulations that was written by Lewis Carroll when he was still Charles Dodgson. He was 13 years old, and he wrote this poem to entertain his siblings. And I chose that very deliberately. I thought very carefully about the kind of voice I wanted at that moment in the middle of the 19th century. And I didn't want Rudyard Kipling and his kind of precepts for manliness in a poem like If. Instead, we've got this voice of a child who is kind of mocking and subverting and playing with this language of didacticism, how to be a young man of empire, Victorian masculinity and virtue, and muscular Christianity and manliness. And it felt really important to allow those often more silenced or marginalised or overlooked voices to be part of telling this history of England, because it takes us beyond the idea of a quest for a truth, but into a kind of conversation across time about what England might be. And one of the things that I really admire in your work, Hannah, is the way that you animate these different voices, sometimes multiple voices in one poetry, and you use in one poem, and you use form to do that in magical ways. So we get the sense of, this kind of multitude of voices speaking through your work.
Can I ask you then, both of you, to talk a little bit more about form? Because I saw an interview with you, Hannah, where you talked about the tightness of the form of poetry, that really allowed you to do something. And for Catherine as well, I kind of wondered, writing a book for a wider audience, that it asks us to think differently about sentence construction and how we get our message across. So how important is form?
Well, I think contemporary poets tend not to use sort of traditional forms anymore, which I think is a great shame. They've kind of gone out of favour. And there's a sort of sense that those sorts of forms, like the sonnet that Catherine was mentioning, or even like sort of traditional rhyme schemes, are sort of like the tools of the patriarchy or something. I've definitely seen that. Why would you want to write like dead white men? But I always had the other idea that, that if you were to write a sonnet, then it would be standing in the tradition of all the other sonnets that had ever been written, and that might lend it perhaps some legitimacy, but also you could innovate and you could do something completely new. So the sonnet was always associated with, love, as in Shakespeare's sonnets, or that's a sort of dominant association. You didn't have to do that with your sonnets. I think I've been reading lots of experimental sonnets when I started to write the kids. So the form in the kids, it's multifaceted really. So all the poems are sonnets, and they're all about my career as a sixth form teacher. And so some of them, the sonnet form just seems to be mimetic, because lots of poems are about classroom encounters. And I started to think, the sonnet just looks a little bit like a classroom, looks a little bit like a blackboard, looks a bit like a page in a book, all the sort of tools that the teachers trade. But I was also working with the very unstable nature of my own memory, and I imagine that many poets feel the same about memory. It's not just there, it's not just accessible. And so the sonnet, it makes you invent and it makes you lie. And if you're trying to write metrically, under pentameter, and with a strict, Petrarchan or a Shakespearean rhyme scheme, you just start inventing. And sometimes you might be so deeply into almost, it's like stitching, and trying to get the stitches exactly in place, that again, ideas of linearity or truth sometimes leave the building. And that was helpful in a book about, I was a teacher and I was writing about my former students. There were ethical considerations as well in terms of that power relationship. Should a teacher be writing about their students? But I felt the form was saving me from those ethical considerations, because I was just having to invent. So none of the students would recognise themselves, because I didn't really describe them as I knew them. Like the sonnet was making me do something else. But we had a very interesting conversation earlier about the sonnet and one of the poems in your book. So it'd be great to hear your reflection.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I think this discussion about the kind of the ethics and politics of form is really, really important. And the conversation we were having earlier was about Wyatt again, and thinking about that kind of distance that the sonnet has travelled from Thomas Wyatt in the 16th century, kind of bringing the sonnet into English literature as this kind of rather kind of classy, exotic, high status, elite, prestige European form that he's using in his writing, through to, as you say, Hannah, you using it in quite a deliberate and self-conscious and radical way to kind of challenge that sense that it always has to be about kind of, elite subjects. And it can be about a class of kids in a comprehensive school. I think that's really interesting, and that's something that I see in lots of the poems that I've chosen in the book. We just mentioned Mary Leaper, so writing in these kind of Popian rhyming couplets, but appropriating that country house language and form to write something that really flips it on its head and kind of takes us sort of underneath the Jane Austen drawing room and underneath the kind of the worlds of Bridgerton. I also see it really powerfully in the poem I chose by Phyllis Wheatley, who is also writing in the 18th century. She's an enslaved Black African woman, enslaved by a family in Boston in North America, And the poem that I chose is her writing with actually incredible license and assertion to a British politician advocating for freedom. And again, she is doing that by kind of appropriating form and appropriating language, but through those idioms, kind of making her own case. So I think, again, with poetry, there's always a sense of kind of what went before, what you're in conversation with, what you're speaking to, and all the kind of history, all the relationship, all the power relationships, all encoded into that. And, I love the way you play with that in your work, Hannah, and I see that, right across the book. You also asked Claire about my own kind of thinking about form in my own writing. And I guess it's an interesting question, because it's the kind of, it felt like that was a question for a poet to think about form, but of course, as historians, we're always thinking about writing in different form, whether it's an academic monograph or a journal article, or increasingly, different kinds of format and idiom. I suppose one thing that I should acknowledge that you will notice is that I'm writing to a certain formula. It's a tried and tested one, history of the world in 100 objects, and all the rest. There's a wealth of books kind of following that formula there. And using that kind of recognised, accessible formula felt like a way to make the proposition of exploring history through poetry kind of accessible, kind of a recognisable and legible template. People know what the offer is, they know how to engage with that. And it also brought, I'm not going to compare this to the strictures of writing within sonnet form, my goodness, but it did bring its own kind of trickiness in terms of discipline, writing those 25 quite short chapters. And there was always more that I wanted to say and more that I wanted to reach out to. I think each chapter begins with a poem, but it does kind of reach out to other texts and the wider historical context and other kinds of stories. For example, the chapter that uses Fleur Adcock's 1986 poem, England's Glory, which is inspired by the iconic Matchbox. It's a brilliant poem, it's really funny. She's kind of writing in quite a playful and wry way about England's perennial north-south divide. And so that chapter kind of opens out over, probably 1,000 years of history, but from a central story about the miners' strike and the moment, and Thatcher's Britain, the moment that Fleur Adcock is writing within. But there had to be a kind of a discipline to that, and one side, I guess, set the rules of the game. I had to stay within them. So there are lots of different ways that you can write a book, bringing together English history and poetry, but these are the rules that I set, and I kind of stayed within those, but I like to think that I maybe broke a few other rules to do with kind of conventions of history or the kinds of selections we make in poetry or how we do chronology in storytelling.
Thank you. That is my favourite chapter in the book, actually. So we've talked a little bit about truth, we've talked about form. Can we now then talk about feeling? Because, the first time I read Catherine's book, it's really, there's a lot of feeling in it, and surprising. And when I was, thinking with your work and reading your work again, it would just, sometimes the feeling would just come and at you. And I wonder for both of you, is feeling what work is feeling doing for you in communicating with your readers, your audience, but also is poetry a distinctive way of generating feeling and actually accessing the feelings of the past?
So I think there can be something very distinctively and powerfully intimate about poetry. And that for me is the power of it in the book, that it's a book in search of what is England and, exploring these big narratives of English history, but not choosing to approach them via the big narratives or perhaps the loudest voices that claim to speak for England, but through these moments of emotional intimacy and connection. I would definitely, I think, want to acknowledge that in the experience of writing this book, I allowed myself to feel a lot more than I think I allow myself to do normally in my academic writing. And I think one of the wonderful things about being a historian at the moment, and working kind of across the humanities at the moment, is that But what academic writing can be is really enlarging and expanding, and increasingly I see academic writing more of themselves into their writing and acknowledging that, because of course it's disingenuous to claim that we are absent from our work and that our feeling is absent. But I leaned into it more. I laughed when writing it aloud in a coffee shop several times, probably seemed really strange. I also cried when I was writing it. And so I think in terms of the work that feeling is doing through the poetry, it is that absolute kind of lightning rod for connection, sometimes with moments that are very strange. Real kind of alterity in terms of worldview, in terms of distance across time. And that's where the wormhole, I think, is such a useful metaphor. So it makes that connection. I think in terms of the work that I would like the book to do for readers, or what I would love it to do in terms of public conversation, is it feels like there is a kind of ethical dimension here, and there is a sense of kind of purpose and mission there, that poetry can generate this really powerful kind of empathy with people in radically different historical moments, with very different views of the world in completely different, sometimes very strange, very other contexts. And it feels like poetry models for us a kind of radical empathy across difference of experience, across time and space, that is very necessary now, and is important. I hope that doesn't sound like a pompous answer, because I feel that very, very deeply.
Thank you. I've also noticed that kind of blurring that's happening in academic writing. Actually, what I'm seeing, probably from the creative writing age and creative non-fiction, how writers are starting to perhaps be writing about their own lives, but also now drawing and bringing into their writing historical research or academic theory. And to me, it's just it's lessening that divide and bringing what might sometimes be perceived as being dry to life. And I've always been fascinated, because I am just I'm almost just like a blob of feeling, that's how I sometimes think. And in an academic setting, I'm I just feel ashamed of myself. But I can't hide what I am. But I'm also, whenever I go to an academic conference, we do the conference, we do the papers and everything, and sometimes they're not creative writing conferences, they might be post-colonial studies conferences, but at the dinners and the drinks, I'm always trying to find out from the academics, what is it, what happened that got you interested in this thing. It might seem quite remote from the assumptions I'm making about you as we're talking. And then what I found out is that there's always a story, because we are feeling beings, and all of us are deeply humane, and we're born creative, and so it's become a little bit of a thing of mine, is sort of probing at those ideas. So poems, yes, they can be emotional vehicles. I was always taken by the Percy Shelley quote, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and how prescient that is at this moment when the world seems to be being led by absolute madmen, and so poetry can speak back to that. But then I also like poems that are just polemic and just outwardly political aren't always the most powerful poems. And so what I've tried to do in my work, because there is a political agenda, and there always has been, right from the beginning, from that first slide, is to essentially unearth the untold stories of the empire and what psychologically and emotionally the empire did to people. So it's really working quite in counter to the stories that are still told about the British Empire, or perhaps exist in the public consciousness. And what I think is the way to do that is to call and to harness empathy, and to focus on the individual singular story as opposed to the stories of the masses. But poets have a little bag of tricks in terms of, and it seems like I shouldn't really be saying this, but there are things that you can do in a poem, and I've been writing poems so long, I kind of know how to work, because I do want to pull on your heartstrings So one of them is using the I voice as a point of identification. Like that can really work, not always. But the other thing that a poetry tutor taught me years ago, that a good poem that touches you always has to have is a thing called the punctum. And it comes from Roland Barthes from Camera Lucida. And he writes about how all good photographs have a punctum. And it's the part that punches you, it's the part that wounds. So in one of the examples he gives, it's a family, a photograph of a black family, probably like in the South in the 19th century in America. And in his reading of the photograph, the punctum is the fact that one of the children's shoe is unbuckled. And he says that's the moment that really touches him, just that little detail. With poetry workshops, we used to have endless debates about what the punctum was, and someone would say, I'm wounded by that thing, I'm punctured by that line or that image. But it's something that I always try to work with. Like, I do have the idea that there is a heart in the reader, and that something I write might touch them, and what touches them might slightly shift their mind about something. Not that I think poetry readers are bigots whose minds need changing, but certainly when you're telling stories of very little known histories, which a lot of my work does, you want to find that emotional and empathetic engagement. So I hope that answers.
I just can't resist coming in on that idea of the punctum, which is so beautiful. We were just talking about Fleur Adcock's poem England's Glory, and I think one of the things that I've found that always kind of gives me shivers with poetry is when that moment is actually a moment of silence in the poem, the thing that's not said. And that is something that I see threaded through many of the examples in the book. Say Fleur Adcock's poem, published in 1986, inspired by this iconic box of matches, and it doesn't mention the miners' strike at all, even though it's talking about kind of northern culture, Durham Miners' Gala, kind of marching bands, the gaudy colours like on the matchbox. There's a kind of a northern matchbox. She's making a joke, not like the kind of Bryant and May safety matches the whips in the South use. You can, it's a strike anywhere match. Strike anywhere, and that word strike anywhere, strike on the soul of the boot. That's the only time she uses the word strike. But it's a poem published in 1986. It's obviously, the whole poem is kind of animated by the miners' strike and kind of compassion for what's going on and what's unfolding in this kind of Thatcher's Britain of the mid-80s. But that moment of kind of arrest and of the kind of gut punch emotional moment is suddenly realising what's not there, but is actually kind of luminous through the whole poem, which is a really funny poem, but also, so kind of emotionally arresting.
Thank you both. I think at this stage we might open it up and see what other people would like to say. So if you have a question or just a point or something you want to say about the relationship between history and poetry, if you would like to raise your hand now, I will come to you and let you use the mic. We'll work backwards from here.
Thanks. I think there's questions for Catherine. You talk about wormholes, and I thought Einstein immediately, and time and relativity, and how he believed that time was. So the faster you move, the slower time ticks, is basically what he was saying in the 1920s. And then I thought back to Hannah's books as well, in terms of the Windrush and racism. And for people that experience racism, time can move slower for us as well. So I was thinking about time, race, and culture. Like, did any of you have any thoughts about how do you convey that in text as well? Because the place I see this best are in films like Chris Nolan's Interstellar and things like Arrival, but also in comics as well, where you've got the split screen option in comics. So how do you convey that in text and make it obvious to an audience? So time being relative, effectively.
That is such a great question. And yeah, the idea that when we're all having a great time at a Creighton event, time is moving faster, right? It kind of whizzes by. And so I need to kind of brush up on my eyesight a bit, Trey, in response to that. But I think that brings us back, your question brings us back to I think for me, it would be really interesting to hear what Hannah has to say, that kind of the way that doing histories through poetry opens up these kind of this elasticity in terms of how we experience and navigate time and thinking about scale. And I was actually really aware as I was writing this book that there are chapters that cover 1,000 years. So quite a kind of pivot point in the middle of the book is, it couldn't not be in there. John of Gaunt's soliloquy from Shakespeare's Richard II, this Sceptre Dial, of course, is there. And kind of looking back to the origins of some of that kind of imaginary and on to appropriations and uses of that poem speech, which is also a poem in kind of later centuries. So it's this long view chapter that kind of takes in centuries. But then there's another chapter which focuses on Edward Thomas's poem Adelstrop. And in a way, the moment that chapter is focused on is just that moment of an unexpected train halt at a railway station. And actually at the beginning of that chapter, I think about, would it be possible to write a history of England in moments, in this tiny kind of slow fragments, particles of time. So I don't know how fully I can answer your question, but I think it's a really interesting provocation, and I definitely feel that through my book, the poems take us to different kind of rhythms of time, different pace, different kinds of exposure, different kind of frames, and time moves differently.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I was thinking of a sequence that I wrote recently. I was commissioned to write a poem or a piece of creative work for an anthology called Refugee Tales, and it's a literary arm that works with the Gatwick detainee support group for people who are detained under our asylum system. And it's still, I think it's so little known, but it's so shocking that Britain is the only country in Europe that has indefinite detention for asylum seekers. So that always makes me think about time, these traumatised people that are sometimes trafficked, or they've come on the small boats or whatever, they've risked their lives to get here, and then they're entered into our asylum system, and immediately, and then they're put in detention. Or they're dispersed, and what their sense of time must be like. Anyway, the thing I had to do for this anthology was meet with someone who'd experienced this, who's now got full refugee status, as the majority of asylum seekers do get. And I met with him in the British Library, and this thing about time, I sat with him for 2 hours while he told me his story of 13 years in the British asylum system, having escaped torture and threats on his life and threats to his family. And then I just went home and I just thought, I do not know what to do with this. The absolute sort of bizarre discrepancy between the 13 years and the 2 hours. So the only thing I could do was kind of write about it. And in the end, I wrote a sequence of 13 sonnets that covered, each of the years he'd been in detention. But the other thing I did, I actually slipped in loads of extra sonnets. So it's called the 13-year tale. And ostensibly, you might flick through and think there's 13 sonnets, but there's not. There's several others. So I think there are ways that poetic form can perhaps deal with some of those, like textually address some of those times. But I have to be honest, when I'm talking about his story, what I really think is, how useful can any representation of that be until that injustice stops? Yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to offer a reflection and invite both of you to reflect on what I feel could be thought of as the common ancestor between both history and poetry, if you like, in that both spring from the human act and practice of, in pre-oral, pre-literate, or I hate calling anything pre-really, it's historically speaking, but in cultures where literature and literacy are not as we would know them here in this room, that oral recounting and remembrance and the passing of information, but also of feeling and of heritage and inheritance and mourning and celebration are by necessity poetic, because that's the tool that things are best recalled by, through rhythm, through a musicality of words, through call and response, through all of us sharing together. So I just wondered how you both felt about that common root, and how here we are sitting in the 21st century and through many generations of inherited practice, we might think of them as being separate, but they spring from the same urge and the same service, if you like.
So this might be a bit of a cheat as an answer. I might be coming at this a bit sideways, but I think there's something really beautiful in what you're saying there about the idea that in the beginning we kind of, in a way, we sung and spoke ourselves and our cultures into being. I suppose my sideways answer will come back to the kind of the safer ground, the familiar territory of my book, because the first poem in the book comes from that oral culture. So the first poem in the book is Cadman's Hymn. An 8th century text. We have it in Bede's Ecclesiastical History. A text that is very deliberately and self-consciously, writing a nation of England into being. Many of you know the story of Cadman. So he's the cowherd in 8th century Northumbria. Quite an unlikely voice to sing kind of English poetry into being, quite a subaltern voice, possibly a Brittonic name, so quite an unlikely figure. And Bede tells us that Cadman is getting on in age, and he's never learnt to sing. So an evening when the harp is passed around the mead hall, Cadman sort of sneaks out alone into the darkness of the cowshed because he can't sing. And one night he's visited by this shining stranger who says, "Cadman, sing me something." And Cadman says, "I don't know how to sing." And the visitor says, "Sing to me of the first creation." And Cadman sings this beautiful song, which is kind of the first words in English to the new Christian God of the English. But what is really interesting about that is that sort of originary moment, the kind of what's often positioned as the foundational text for English poetry and for Englishness in some ways, is that it is on this slippery border between orality and literacy. And Bede actually, even though this is the first song in English, he gives it to us in Latin, very apologetically, saying, sorry, a translation can never do full justice to the beauty of the original. And he gives us this oral performance, this English song in Latin, in a written text. And it's only over the centuries that English kind of creeps back into the text, first from the margins, and then gradually into the canonical text itself. So there's something so powerful and elusive and enchanting about reaching back to those oral worlds and the kind of fragments that survive and how they speak to us of very distant and remote pasts. There's always a slipperiness with anything that we have that kind of records or passes them to us. But that's, for me, a fascinating part of the story, how those narratives are crafted with fragments from orality into our kind of foundational myths. So that was a bit of a sideways answer. I'm going to pass over to Hannah.
I don't know if I'm a non-answer from me, but I love it. I absolutely love the idea of that. What you just articulated about that common root. And it made me think about, the people that used to have that role within the community or the tribe, the griot, and how that's, that role is passed down and how important it was as a way of people knowing, who their group was. And poetry was a part of that as well. It wasn't separate. And of course, poems are always better when read aloud. And that is the form, and that's the way I edit writing, is to read it aloud. And then I always think in some ways, poems are a little bit like plays. When you read a play, a play isn't finished until it's performed, but I think that's the same about a poem. A poem isn't finished till you've heard it aloud. It got me thinking about some other things in my mind all of a sudden. Just got, No, the whole idea, so I mean, look, yes, here we are, all these, centuries and centuries of thinking and writing and doing later. But I've noticed, I don't know if it can't be a new thing, but it's just my awareness of it. The idea of storytelling I've heard various people talking about it recently as something that we need to bring back into our culture, but not just in terms of like storytelling in school or whatever, but actually I've heard lots of people talking about how organisations are not going to be able to cope with the future unless they start to harness storytelling, because they need to be able to, one, tell perhaps the sort of foundational stories of what they've been doing and why, but also the stories of how they're going to deal with what's coming down the line. So storytelling. And also, I was listening to the new leader of the Green Party, who's on this sort of agenda to like harness kind of more sort of eco-populism, and he was talking about how he planned to do that through emotive storytelling. And I thought, people are sort of like, we're so saturated now with messages in every walk of our life, but people begin to realise the sort of purity of the story is an incredibly useful vehicle and might be something that it enables us to, travel into these new waters of the future.
Okay, there were some more hands, so please do.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for your reflections. It's been such an interesting evening so far. I just had a question, I guess it ties into some of the other things that have already been asked about, how poetry connects us to something ineffable, and the feeling behind the words, and we can feel that connection across so many centuries. And what do you think this means in an age of machine learning, where recently, I won't out this friend, I saw someone post a picture into ChatGPT and then get it to write a poem and put that poem on their Instagram. But what does the future look like for telling history with poetry in an age of AI? And how does this create perhaps like a methodology or a path for historians to maintain relevance at a time when we're the #1 job at risk, apparently, according to certain US studies of jobs at risk through AI? Thank you.
And I think we might just pick up another question as well. We'll stop pairing them because I'm aware that there were a lot of hands up. So we'll put one there and one there.
Thanks both. That was a really interesting conversation. I've been furiously making notes. I just wanted to touch back into this idea of archive, considering that collecting organisations are so often formed and framed in those colonial contexts. But the personal archive that you've been describing, that timeline, there's a lot more kind of possibility and it's a lot more jumbled in terms of that timeline. So often in my own work, when I see people encounter original records, especially if those people from diasporic backgrounds, there's a real sense of power in seeing them represented in the archive. There's that kind of punctum that you were both speaking about. And I just wanted to hear a bit more about what you thought about the tension there between the kind of formal archive and the kind of informal archive.
Thank you. So you've got AI and archives.
Well, I might start with a few reflections on AI. It's something I have been thinking about. Some of you might know that I've done some thinking and some publishing on this. But I've been thinking about it a lot in relation to this particular project. And one of the things I've wondered is when people listen to the audiobook of this, which I recorded, will they be able to tell where the producer had to kind of stop or had to do a bit of editing because I got emotional? So the chapter on Adlestrop and the Great War, or Pearl and the grieving father, there were feelings, some moments that caught me by surprise actually. And I wonder whether when people listen they'll hear anything in my voice. I'm sure they won't hear the joins, it's all been expertly done, but will they be able to hear that? And then, as I've been reflecting on that, I read an article in the newspaper about how it might be possible that AI voices read audiobooks in the future. I think I'm not going to name any companies, but I think one big company was trialling this, which just seemed, horrific to lose that kind of human, emotional connection with the words that are being spoken. And it really feels like, again, this feels like making a very grand claim, but I'm going to make it, that writing history of England through poetry is like an act of resistance against the machines, because a machine cannot write this kind of history. An AI might be able to do the next token recognition and, you know, give a semblance that it's connecting with the emotion of the past, but it takes a human to listen to those words from another human across time and connect with them. So that it feels like it's a small, in a very small way, a kind of an act of resistance and radicalism, maybe. I'll pass over to you, Mary.
I don't know what to say about AI. I just feel like it's the really big party pooper. I don't believe AI is yet capable of writing poems that carry the kind of sophisticated humanity that people do. But I am worried it will be able to start performing something like that. And that's why it's a great shame. I also have been like going mad on it and like using it for everything. So, you know, that's its pull. I think what we're going to see the difficulty, I'm sure everyone's talking about this and know this, is between those of us that grew up with libraries and being able to search and use archives and a generation that won't be able to do that and what that means. In answer to the other question, I thought I'd show you the photo, except actually, that might not happen. But the thing about them, wow, it's very... Will it?
I don't know.
Okay, well, I wanted to get to a photo of Nelsa, but if you get there, it's not really moving, is it? I might do it manually. Yeah, I had, you know, those moments where people that have perhaps not seen themselves written into, like, the national story, for example. Next one. Yeah, I'll talk about that. And then discover themselves in archival records. I can say the way I found my father on the passenger list of the award. It can be an amazing amount of recognition. Partly, in my own case, it was like, oh, so it's all true. Like he did come from Jamaica. He never actually confirmed it. But it can also be, and I think one of the things about formal archives in terms of people from those communities that might be encountering material that's actually quite difficult to access, and that we also need to think about that, you know, what does it mean to find your forebears on, say, the passenger list of ships that brought indentured labourers over from China or parts of India, you know, on records of slavery, you know, and so we really need to think about what formal archives can do and how they can be used and we can be supported in our use. I'm showing you this photograph just to speak a little bit about my latest book, which is, this is my aunt, it's one of my dad's many siblings. I think he had 11. They all had the same Chinese father and different Afro-Chinese mothers. And I always knew about this aunt in the family. She was said to be my dad's favourite sister. And I knew that her life had ended quite tragically. When I Googled her, which is like always the first point of starting with the research, there's one hit about her which describes her running a restaurant in downtown Kingston and calls her the legendary Hannah Lowe. But then nothing else, right? And so, you know, that was like 8 years ago, and I've been off finding out why she was the legendary Hannah Lowe. But what I found is there are things in the archive about her in like formal archives, like there are other newspaper articles pertaining to her life, but essentially the archive is empty. And her story involves disability, sex work, really of a woman making their own way in a man's world. And I began to think, you know, what do you do when the archive, if you want to tell the story of someone's life and the archive is empty, you know, what do you do? And so I began to think about, and this is where I'm interested to see what a historian would think of the sorts of things that I began to engage with were not in any way like legitimate methods of research, but instead I commissioned artists to respond to the poem and to the photo, and other writers to respond to the photo, and I engaged in a number of like diasporic spiritual practices to do with ancestor veneration in order to bring her to life. And I was thinking, I guess I was sort of in some ways referencing someone like what Sadia Hartman's been doing with critical fabulation, making these arguments of those people, particularly women, that are literally absent from archives. Do we just forget them, or do we turn elsewhere in order to be able to tell their stories and speak of them? So I don't know if you want to.
Well, I would just add really briefly in terms of methods. So definitely in the last few years as a historian, I've worked a lot with creative practitioners and those kind of methods you describe, and I know my colleagues in the IHR have, and also spent some time at Alderley Edge in Cheshire being taught how to use divining rods by a pagan in the course of a publicly funded research project there. It's a great question about the archive and power. I think I've tried to be alert to that in my book. I'm going to just, again, cheat ever so slightly and show a couple of things from the archive that don't speak to that so directly, but that I had maybe to share with you. Actually, I think I'll just share this one because the colleague who tipped me off that this is in special collections in Senate House Library is here, spotted him, Alex, my colleague from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. And this was a really gorgeous archival find. In the process of writing the book, this is a poem that everyone will know. This is Auden's Funeral Blues. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. So we all know it, from for weddings and a funeral and lots of other contexts. And the original version of the poem was written in a play published in 1936. It's quite different. It starts off the same, but it becomes this absurd, ludicrous, bitterly satirical kind of parody of mourning. It's a political poem kind of targeting the cult of the great man, the rise of totalitarianism and nationalism. But then Auden kind of worked it into the more sort of universal, powerful, and more authentic, genuine, perhaps, reflection on mourning that we know and love today. And there's this brilliant letter in the archive here in the University of London where a school teacher called Miss Boyd, and actually, school teachers called Miss Boyd don't appear in the archive very often, do they? And she wrote to Auden saying, can you suggest any contemporary poetry that I could teach that's suitable for children? So this is up to age 14. And Auden has written this amazing letter back saying, well, bit of a problem. The things that modern poets are interested in, as a rule, children aren't much interested in. But he says, here are some suggestions from my own work. And he divides his own poems into categories. I think there's something like clean, but perhaps too difficult, easy, but perhaps not clean enough. So he categorises it in this way. And then he says, but you might be interested in this piece that I'm working on, and it's an early autograph version of Funeral Blues as we know it now. So just a really nice archival moment, kind of encountering, it was actually really nice, actually, because a great kind of figure, a luminary in the world of poetry, and a school teacher receiving this very full and thoughtful response for him and seeing the poem in a moment in its evolution.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end of the time that we have. If there are a couple of last quick questions or comments, anybody would like to make around the room?
It's a quick comment, but it's a big question, I think. I'll save the anecdote, but what do you reckon your work says about religious faith and or the lack of it?
Can we reset the clock, Well, I'm not going to make any claims for what my work says about it. I think some of the poems in the book say fascinating things about it. So there's a Tennyson poem in there. I didn't choose The Child of the Light Brigade. I wanted to choose poems that were less obvious as ways into history. So it's a section from In Memoriam where he's wrestling with kind of 19th century science and learning and religious faith. There's a poem by Anne Askew, a woman who was burned at the stake for a real technicality in her passionate and deeply held Christian faith that about 6 months later became the correct view to have. And I think I wrestled with the ethics of using her poem as a window into history when actually she wants her poem to send us somewhere else, to take us away from the world and have us thinking about God and inspiring us to something very different. There's the Pearl poet, the dreamer mourning the death of his daughter and looking kind of for religious consolation. So I think there are moments in the poems in the book that have really powerful and provocative and challenging and enriching things to say about religious faith, but I think I'm interpreting some of those, but I'm not the one saying them.
Was that question even for me? I don't think it was really for me, that question. All I could say, I just touched on it a little bit really, my own work. I mean, I was brought up in a family of like almost like fundamental atheists, you know, and partly that was because my father, like many of the people that were involved in the Jamaican independence movement, was also kind of communist leaning, and atheism was very, very sort of deeply held to him. And only that in my, well, I don't know how to say this without sounding really like very, it's not about religious faith at all really, but only that what I've found writing to be, creative writing, is almost like a spiritual experience. It's some kind of higher consciousness. And any creative writers in here that take it that seriously might have had that experience of writing something, spending a couple of hours writing something, and then leaving the room and then coming back and being like, oh, like, who was sat here? Because it wasn't me, it wasn't the person that's just been into the dishwasher. And only that sense of my own consciousness of the spiritual aspects of writing is probably what's led me, as well as the issues of archival absence, towards some of the spiritual practices that might have been used by my ancestors. And that, you know, my dad will be turning in his grave, and no one is more surprised than me about that, but I don't think I could say anything more about religious faith in any broader way. It's quite anecdotal, but thank you for the question.
Thank you both. I think we are at time. Please do come and join us for the reception just out there to formally launch Catherine's book. But I'd like to say a massive thank you to both of our speakers. It's just been an absolutely just lovely conversation, rich, thoughtful, moving by turns, really just perfect conversation on history and poetry. So if you can join me in thanking our speakers.